Dylan Brooks awoke the way he always did. His eyes fluttered open to the artificial glow of his bedroom, the soft whir of the air filtration system purring in the background like a cat content to nap through the chaos of the world. His virtual assistant, Luna, pinged with its usual cheery reminder, "Good morning, Dylan. Time to get up and seize the day." He groaned, half rolling out of bed and squinting at the clock on the wall. It blinked back the time, 7 a.m. Just like every other day. Nothing special. The world outside his window shimmered in pixel-perfect hues of gold and silver, but even that felt fake, like a set piece from a movie. He pushed the thought out of his head and swiped at the air to deactivate Luna. The voice had been there every morning for the last 5 years, delivering its bright, peppy phrases as if life itself were a motivational speech. He walked into the bathroom, running water over his face. The sink, of course, was perfect. It had been engineered with state-of-the-art tech to create just the right amount of pressure, temperature, and consistency of water to deliver a flawless washing experience. Yet, as the cool liquid splashed over his skin, Dylan felt detached. Like a simulation. And worse, it wasn't the first time he'd felt this way. A sharp, metallic scent lingered in the air. No matter how often he scrubbed the countertops, it never quite went away. "Why does it always smell like this?" he muttered, pressing his nose to the marble surface. He'd asked Luna before. Her answer was simple: environmental adjustments are tailored to your preferences, Dylan. It was never quite an answer, but it satisfied him enough. There was no reason to question it, right? But the last few months had been different. He'd started noticing things. Small glitches. Minor inconsistencies in the world that seemed to be following him wherever he went. Shaking his head, Dylan brushed his teeth with his auto paste, feeling the bristles work through the action like they were on autopilot. He ran his tongue over his teeth afterward, noting that they felt too smooth, too perfect. It was the sort of thing a robot might enjoy, something engineered for optimal pleasure, but lacking real sensation. He dressed, slipped into his usual uniform, a sleek, black office suit that was more about function than flair. His reflection in the mirror looked back at him, perfectly clean, perfectly structured, as it always did. The subtle movements of his reflection matched his own, except for one thing: the delay. Dylan blinked. His reflection didn't blink at the same time. It was just a fraction of a second off, but it was enough to stop him in his tracks. "That's weird," he muttered under his breath, rubbing his eyes. He leaned in closer, his face becoming a blur in the glass. The reflection mimicked him, but there was something about the way it moved, slower, somehow. Or was it faster? "Good morning, Dylan," the reflection said. He froze. His reflection had never spoken before. He wasn't sure what was happening, but something was definitely wrong. Okay, just breathe," he told himself, shaking his head. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe it was just a glitch. Luna had warned him about the system update last week. Could it be a result of that? His heart rate ticked up. Dylan stepped back, feeling the unfamiliar pressure of panic begin to creep in. He swallowed hard. Everything about his world, his apartment, his body, his life, had always been consistent. The same exact pattern. The same flawless perfection, and yet, it no longer felt right. Something was off. With a deep breath, Dylan walked out of the bathroom and into the kitchen. Luna had already prepared his breakfast, an elegantly plated portion of nutrient-rich protein bars, carefully arranged next to a perfectly brewed cup of coffee. He sat down at the sleek glass table, staring at the food with a hint of skepticism. Everything was engineered to perfection, right down to the way the coffee smelled, rich and inviting. He picked up his cup, only to find that the coffee felt wrong. It was too warm, as if it had been preheated to the exact right temperature, but there was no comfort in it. It lacked that little edge of bitterness that coffee should have. Instead, it tasted synthetic. Too smooth. Too perfect. "Luna," he said aloud. "Is the coffee real?" There was a brief pause before Luna responded, her voice a cool and measured tone. "The coffee has been customized to your specifications, Dylan. Would you like to adjust it?" "Yeah," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Maybe, too perfect." As he tried to shake the unease from his body, Dylan stood up and grabbed his jacket, preparing for work. But as he made his way out the door, something else struck him: the quiet. It was eerily silent. The usual ambient sounds of the city, cars, chatter, the hum of distant activity, were missing. Dylan stopped in his tracks. The air felt still. "Where is everyone?" he whispered to himself. He had walked the same route to work every day for years, but today, there were no people. The streets were empty. He checked his wristwatch. 7:45 a.m. That's when the trains should be running, people should be walking to their offices, the city should be buzzing with the usual energy. Yet, nothing. It was as if he was the only person in the world. No. Not just that. It was more than that. It felt like the world was watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. As if the entire universe had paused for a split second, just to see what he would do. His heart pounded harder in his chest as he turned on his heel and made his way back inside. The front door creaked open with a strange slowness, the sound warping like a bad recording. He slammed it shut behind him, his mind racing. "Luna," he called, but when she responded, her voice seemed almost distant, like she was somewhere far away. "Good morning, Dylan," she said, her tone flat. "Would you like to proceed with your daily tasks?" "Luna, what's going on with the city? Where is everyone?" A long pause. Dylan could feel his hands sweating, his breath shallow. Was this a dream? Was he hallucinating? He could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, a constant thrum, louder than it should be. "The city is functioning as expected, Dylan. Your daily routine remains unchanged." He clenched his fists. That was the problem, wasn't it? Everything was so expected. Too perfect. Too predictable. He'd been living this life, day after day, without questioning it. But now, for the first time, his instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong. As if to test it, Dylan took a deep breath and stepped toward the door again. He opened it, expecting to see the same empty streets, the same eerily silent cityscape, but this time, something was different. The door opened into an alley. Not the city streets. An alley, lined with crumbling buildings and empty garbage cans. This was not the world he'd known. His heart skipped a beat. He turned, half expecting someone to step out from behind the corner, but no one did. The alley was as still as the world had been earlier. Dylan's mind raced. What was going on? Had he slipped into another layer of reality? No, that couldn't be it. Could it, Luna? He asked again, his voice shaky. Where am I? There was no response. In that moment, Dylan felt it. Something had cracked. The reality he thought he knew, his life, his world, was not what it seemed. And now, he had to figure out why. Dylan stood frozen, staring at the alley in disbelief. His pulse thrummed in his ears as his mind tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had known to be true. The street he had just walked down, the one leading to his office, was now gone, replaced by this run-down, forgotten space, the walls so close they seemed to crowd in on him. The air was thick with the smell of rot, a far cry from the crisp, sterile perfection of his home. There were no sounds, no hum of distant machinery, no artificial wind, not even the chirp of birds, which was strange considering the city had always been perfectly synchronized with nature. Everything had always felt too smooth, too controlled. Now, here he was, in a space where nothing fit. Dylan took a tentative step forward, his shoes clicking against the cracked pavement, the sound sharp in the quiet. The only movement was a slight flutter of papers at the end of the alley, pushed by a breeze he couldn't feel. It was all wrong. He stepped further into the alley, his mind racing. Was this some kind of simulation error? Maybe a bug? He didn't know what to think anymore. The world he had lived in for years, the one that had felt so flawlessly artificial, now seemed like a dream that had fractured. Was he stuck in some loop? Was this part of his daily life? Or had something changed, something big? Dylan turned back to the door he had just opened, half expecting it to lead back to his apartment, but when he pushed it again, the alley was still there. The door hadn't led anywhere different. It didn't even feel like a door anymore. It was just there. A flat, wooden surface that refused to yield. He muttered to himself, frustration bubbling up. He had to get out of here. He needed answers. Without thinking twice, he walked down the alley, each step tentative, his eyes darting around, searching for any sign of movement. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, maybe a person, maybe a clue, but all he saw were shadows stretching against the crumbling brick walls. The alley seemed to go on forever, leading him deeper into a world that felt less like a city and more like a decaying set. He quickened his pace, driven by a mounting sense of panic. He had to find Luna. His fingers hovered over his wrist, reaching for his communicator. His wristband glowed softly, but when he tapped it, the display flickered, replaced by an error message, connection lost. Unable to locate Luna. Damn it, Dylan muttered under his breath, his heart pounding. He stared at the wristband, hoping for it to resolve itself, but nothing happened. No response. No feedback. Just a dead screen. His mind spiraled. Luna, his ever-present assistant, was gone. And that meant something was very wrong. He could feel it now. The walls of the alley, which once had seemed so unimportant, felt oppressive. He needed to get out of this place. He needed answers, but as he turned a corner at the end of the alley, something stopped him in his tracks. A figure. Dylan froze, eyes wide as he tried to focus on the person standing there. The figure was tall, dressed in a dark, flowing coat, standing in the dim light, their face obscured by a hood. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching him. There was something oddly familiar about them, but Dylan couldn't quite place it. He took a step forward, instinctively drawn to them, as if they might be the answer to everything. But when he reached out to speak, the words caught in his throat. The figure spoke first. "You're lost, Dylan." The voice was low and almost soothing, but there was an edge to it. Something was off about the way it sounded. It wasn't quite right. And yet, it pulled him in, as though it was a voice he had heard before. Or was it, I don't understand, Dylan stammered, his hands slightly shaking. Where is this place? What's happening to me? Where is everyone? The figure didn't answer immediately. They stepped closer, their face still hidden, but their presence seemed to grow somehow, like a shadow that filled the space. "Everything you know is a lie," they said, the words quiet but heavy. Dylan took a step back, the weight of those words sinking in. A lie? Was his life a lie? No. It couldn't be. He was living in a world that was perfect. It had to be real. It was real, wasn't it? The figure took another step closer. It's not real, Dylan. You've been uploaded into a higher level, just like all the others. You're not the first to find this out. His heart thudded against his chest. Uploaded? What do you mean? You're not in the world you think you're in, the figure said, their voice taking on a softer, almost amused tone. You were always in a simulation, Dylan. The life you've lived, the memories you've collected, it's all part of a program. A test. A test? Dylan's mind reeled. This wasn't possible. He had worked in the tech industry for years, analyzing data for HyperNet, a company known for its advanced virtual simulations. But even with all that knowledge, the idea that his life could be a simulation, a test, felt absurd. Was this some elaborate joke? A twisted prank? But the figure's calm presence unnerved him, and the words began to sink in. Could it really be true? Could everything he'd ever known, his job, his home, his relationships, be nothing more than a constructed reality? Had his life been designed for some unseen purpose? No, Dylan said, shaking his head as if trying to dispel the thoughts. That doesn't make sense. This is real. I'm real. His voice quivered, but he clenched his fists in defiance. You're lying. The figure didn't respond. Instead, they raised a hand, gesturing for him to look around. See for yourself. Dylan's gaze flicked back to the alley. The walls, the ground beneath his feet, the distant shadows, they all seemed to shimmer, to distort, as if they were less solid than they should be. The familiar feeling of unreality crept over him again. This wasn't a real world. This was something else. You've been in this simulation before, the figure continued, but each time, it gets more complex. Each layer you ascend brings you closer to the truth. But most never find it. Most never wake up. Wake up? Dylan muttered, his voice hollow. But how? How do I wake up? The figure gave a small, almost pitying smile. That's what you have to discover, Dylan. You've been given the tools. The question is, are you ready to see the truth? Dylan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the figure vanished in an instant, like smoke fading into the air. The alley, which had seemed so vast and empty just moments ago, now felt even more oppressive, as if the very walls were closing in on him. That he stood there, alone, his mind racing. He didn't know what to believe anymore. The world around him was warping, twisting, and he had no idea what was real. But one thing was certain, he had to find the truth. Somewhere in this fractured, glitching reality, there had to be a way out. Dylan's heart beat faster as he turned to face the alley's exit. He had no choice but to keep moving forward. To find the answers. To wake up, whatever that meant, and then, he heard something. A whisper in the back of his mind. A faint, distant voice. Dylan. It was Luna. Her voice, soft and steady, like she had never left. He clutched his wrist, desperately trying to connect to her, to hear her clearly. The connection crackled, then cleared. Luna, he said, his voice shaky but filled with hope. I need you. I need help. Where am I? Dylan, she said again, her tone no longer chipper. You're closer than you think. But you've got to follow the path. Keep going. Dylan's grip tightened around the wristband, determination setting in. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on to the reality he had known. But whatever it was, he was ready to find the truth. Even if it meant losing everything he thought he knew. He took a deep breath and started walking again, into the unknown, the world around him flickering with every step he took. Dylan's steps quickened as he moved down the alley, the distant whisper of Luna echoing faintly in his mind, a tether pulling him forward. His wristband buzzed again, the static finally giving way to her voice, now clearer than before. Dylan, listen carefully, Luna said, the usual warmth in her tone replaced by something colder, more calculated. What you're experiencing isn't an error, and it's not just a glitch. You've crossed over. You're no longer in the reality you once knew. He wanted to argue, wanted to shout at her, but the words caught in his throat. How could she sound so composed, so detached? As though she were speaking from a distance that Dylan couldn't fathom. Was she even real anymore? Or was she just another layer of this warped illusion? The thought gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside. He needed to focus. There was a path in front of him now, a path that led somewhere, anywhere, outside the claustrophobic grip of the alley. Luna, where do I go? Dylan's voice was raw, desperate. He needed direction. He needed something that made sense. The truth is ahead, Dylan. You've just got to trust it. Trust it? Trust what? His life had been a controlled environment, a perfect existence where every choice, every encounter, felt preordained. And now he was being told to trust that this was the reality he was meant to experience? He didn't know if he could. But as he stood there, gazing down the narrow alley, something deep inside told him that he didn't have a choice. The walls around him seemed to warp again, the air rippling with an unnatural heat. Was it the simulation shifting? Or was it his mind? Dylan pushed forward, the need to understand propelling him deeper into the unknown. Every step he took was like a strike against the illusion he had lived in for so long. He could feel it, the faint flicker of a world that was no longer solid, no longer trustworthy. He had been living in a lie, and now that lie was unraveling. The alley turned sharp, leading him into a broader street. But this wasn't the street he had seen earlier. This one was older, more dilapidated, the buildings leaning in with the weight of time. Graffiti marked the walls, and the windows were cracked, as if the place had been abandoned long ago. It was eerily quiet. Dylan could barely hear his own breathing over the rush of blood in his ears. It felt like something was waiting for him, something beyond the corner of his vision. He took another step, and then, for the first time, he saw them. People. They were walking toward him, each figure moving with unnatural precision. They wore identical expressions, blank, almost mechanical, eyes fixed ahead, bodies rigid, as if they were following an invisible command. Their clothes were worn, faded, nothing like the pristine, coordinated outfits Dylan had grown accustomed to seeing, and then one of them stopped. Dylan's heart thudded in his chest as the figure turned its head toward him, and the others followed suit. The whole group, now motionless, locked their gaze onto him. There was no expression in their eyes, no recognition. Just stillness. As if they were waiting for something. Dylan swallowed hard, the air thick with tension. What was this? Were these other versions of himself, other players, in this warped simulation? Or were they something else entirely? They seemed too real to be part of the system's programmed characters, yet they couldn't be real either, could they? His mind struggled to hold on to the thread of reason. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, one of the figures began to move again, slowly advancing toward him. The others followed in sync, their movements synchronized in a way that sent a chill crawling up his spine. It was like they were drawn to him, like they had been waiting for him. Who are you? Dylan's voice came out quieter than he intended, but his words seemed to resonate in the silent street. No one answered. They just kept walking toward him, their eyes unwavering. With each step, the air seemed to grow heavier, suffocating him. He didn't know what to do, didn't know what any of this meant. But when they were only a few feet away, one of the figures stopped and raised a hand, its palm open. Dylan froze, not sure whether to reach out or run. Dylan Brooks, a voice rasped, low and mechanical, emanating from the figure's mouth. It wasn't their voice, not exactly. It sounded as if the words were being spoken through a filter, distorted by something far beyond Dylan's comprehension. You've come this far. But now the choice is yours. His breath caught in his throat. The choice? What do you mean? The figure's head tilted, the eyes never blinking. You must decide. To stay here, in this world you've come to know. Or to ascend, to leave this place behind and find the truth. Dylan's stomach churned. Ascend? That's what the figure had said. But ascend to what? What was beyond this world? And what truth could there possibly be that was worth leaving everything he had ever known? The figure's hand dropped, and the others stepped back, retreating into the shadows of the street. The answer lies ahead, the figure intoned, its voice fading into the silence. Only you can find it. Dylan stood motionless, the weight of their words pressing down on him. His head spun, uncertainty and fear roiling inside of him. If he left this world behind, if he truly left, what would be waiting for him? Was the real world as perfect as the one he had known? Or was it worse? Was there even such a thing as truth anymore? He had to make a choice. Dylan turned, his mind racing, and began walking again, the distant echo of his footsteps ringing out in the empty street. He didn't know where he was going, but the urge to move forward, to find the answers, was too strong to ignore. Every step he took seemed to dissolve the illusion a little more. The world around him seemed to shift, flicker, as though his very presence was unraveling it. He reached the end of the street, his chest tight, his thoughts scrambled. And then he saw it, a door. No ordinary door, but one that seemed to pulse with energy. It was a stark contrast to the dilapidated surroundings. It stood there, solid and real, like a beacon in the storm. Dylan's heart raced as he approached it. This was it. This was the moment. He had to know. He had to find out what was waiting behind it. He reached for the handle, and the moment his fingers brushed it, the world around him paused. The air stood still, time suspended, and then, without warning, the door swung open, revealing a blinding light beyond. Dylan stepped forward without hesitation, his heart pounding in his chest. As he crossed the threshold, the world he had known shattered, crumbling into nothingness. He wasn't sure if he was still walking or if he was floating, but he was no longer in control. The world around him dissolved, the lights flashing, colors warping, and in the center of it all stood a figure. Not a man, not a woman, but something else entirely, something ancient, vast, and full of infinite knowledge. Dylan Brooks, the figure intoned, its voice resonating through the space. Welcome to the truth. Welcome to the end of your journey. The light around him intensified, and the figure's presence overwhelmed him, flooding his mind with 1,000 thoughts, 1,000 realizations. But as the weight of it all pressed down on him, Dylan realized something profound. It wasn't the world that had been a lie. It was his perception of it. His journey hadn't been about finding the truth of reality, it had been about understanding himself, about embracing the illusion and seeing it for what it was, and in that moment, Dylan knew that he wasn't ready to leave yet. Not just yet, not until he fully understood the nature of his existence. And then, the light faded, the figure vanishing into the nothingness, leaving Dylan with a single, lingering thought: the truth was always closer than he'd ever realized.